Hello, my name is Jordan Leininger, and I am the Artifact Specialist for the City of Monterey, and I am going to read to you Chapter 20 from Cannery Row inside Ed Ricketts' old home and lab, Pacific Biological Laboratories, located on Cannery Row. Here is Chapter 20. In the mid-morning, the Model T truck rolled triumphantly home to Cannery Row and hopped the gutter and creaked up through the weeds to its place behind Lee Chong's. The boys blocked up the front wheels, drained what gasoline was left into a 5-gallon can, took their frogs, and went warily home to the Palace Flophouse. Then Mac made a ceremonious visit to Lee Chong while the boys got a fire going in the big stove. Mac thanked Lee with dignity for lending the truck. He spoke of the great success of the trip, of the hundreds of frogs taken. Lee smiled shyly and waited for the inevitable. "We're in the chips," Mac said enthusiastically. "Doc paid us for a nickel a frog, and we got about 1,000. Lee nodded. The price was standard. Everybody knew that. "Doc's away," said Mac. "Jesus, is he going to be happy when he sees all them frogs?" Lee nodded again. He knew Doc was away, and he also knew where the conversation was going. "Say, by the way," said Mac, as though he had just thought of it, "we're a little bit short right now." He managed to make it sound like a very unusual situation. "No whiskey," said Lee Chong, and he smiled. Mac was outraged. "What would we want whiskey for? Why, we got a gallon of the finest whiskey you ever laid a lip over, a whole full goddamned running over gallon. By the way," he continued, "I and the boys would like to have you just step up for a snort with us. They told me to ask you." In spite of himself, Lee smiled with pleasure. They wouldn't offer it if they didn't have it. "No," said Mac, "I'll lay it on the line. I and the boys are pretty short and we're pretty hungry. You know the price of frogs is 20 for a buck. Now Doc is away and we're hungry. So what we thought is this. We don't want to see you lose nothing, so we'll make over to you 25 frogs for a buck. You get a 5-frog profit there and nobody loses his shirt." "No," said Lee, "no money." "Well, hell, Lee, all we need is a little groceries. I'll tell you what, we want to give Doc a little party when he gets back. We got plenty of liquor, but we'd like to get maybe some steaks and stuff like that. He's such a nice guy. Hell, when your wife had that bad tooth, who gave her the laudanum?" Mac had him. Lee was indebted to Doc, deeply indebted. What Lee was having trouble comprehending was how his indebtedness to Doc made it necessary that he give credit to Mac. "We don't want you to have, like, a mortgage on frogs," Mac went on. "We will actually deliver right into your hands 25 frogs for every buck of groceries you let us have, and you can come to the party too." Lee's mind nosed over the proposition like a mouse in a cheese cupboard. He could find nothing wrong with it. The whole thing was legitimate. Frogs were cash as far as Doc was concerned. The price was standard, and Lee had a double profit. He had his 5-frog margin and also had the grocery markup. The whole thing hinged on whether they actually had any frogs. "We go see Flog," Lee said at last. In front of the palace, he had a drink of whiskey, inspected the damp sack of frogs, and agreed to the transaction. He stipulated, however, that he would take no dead frogs. Mac now counted 50 frogs into a can and walked back to the grocery with Lee and got $2 worth of bacon and eggs and bread. Lee, anticipating a brisk business, brought a big packing case out and put it into the vegetable department. He emptied the 50 frogs into it and covered it with a wet gunny sack to keep his charges happy. And business was brisk. Eddie sauntered down and bought 2 frogs worth of Bull Durham. Jones was outraged a little later when the price of Coca-Cola went up from 1 to 2 frogs. In fact, bitterness arose as the day wore on and the prices went up. Steak, for instance, the very best steak, shouldn't have been more than 10 frogs a pound, but Lee set it at 12.5. Canned peaches were sky high, 8 frogs for a number 2 can. Lee had a stranglehold on the consumers. He was pretty sure that the thrift market or Holman's would not approve of this monetary system. If the boys wanted steak, they knew they had to pay Lee's prices. Feeling ran high when Hazel, who had coveted a pair of yellow silk armbands for a long time, was told that he didn't want to pay 35 frogs for them. He could go somewhere else. The poison of greed was already creeping into the innocent and laudable merchandising agreement. Bitterness was piling up, but in Lee's packing case The frogs were piling up too. Financial bitterness could not eat too deeply into Mac and the boys, for they were not mercantile men. They did not measure their joy in goods sold, their egos in blank balances, nor their loves in what they cost. While they were mildly irritated that Lee was taking them for an economic ride, or perhaps hop, $2 worth of bacon and eggs was in their stomachs, lying right on top of a fine slug of whiskey, and right on top of the breakfast was another slug of whiskey. And they sat in their own chairs in their own house and watched Darling learning to drink canned milk out of a sardine can. Darling was and was so destined to remain a very happy dog, for in the group of 5 men there were 5 distinct theories of dog training, theories which clashed so that Darling never got any training at all. From the first, she was a precocious bitch. She slept on the bed of the man who had given her the last bribe. They really stole for her sometimes. They wooed her away from one another. Occasionally, all 5 agreed that things had to change and that Darling must be disciplined. But in the discussion of method, the intention inevitably drifted away. They were in love with her. They found the little puddle she left on the floor charming. They bored all their acquaintances with her cuteness, and they would have killed her with food if in the end she hadn't better sense than they. Jones made her a bed in the bottom of the grandfather clock, but Darling never used it. She slept with one or another of them as the fancy moved her. She chewed the blankets, tore the mattresses, sprayed the feathers out of the pillows. She coquetted played her owners against one another. They thought she was wonderful. Mac intended to teach her tricks and go in vaudeville, and she didn't even housebreak her. They sat in the afternoon, smoking, digesting, considering, now and then having a delicate drink from the jug. And each time they warned that they must not take too much, for it was to be for Doc. They must not forget that for a minute. "What time you figure he'll be back?" Eddie asked. "Usually gets in about 8 or 9 o'clock, said Mac. "Now we got to figure when we're going to give it. I think we ought to give it tonight." "Sure," the others agreed. "Maybe he might be tired," Hazel suggested. "That's a long drive." "Hell," said Jones. "Nothing rests you like a good party. I've been so dog-tired, my pants was dragging. And then I went to the party and felt fine." "We got to do some real thinking," said Mac. "Where are we going to give it? Here?" "Well, Doc, he likes his music. He's always got his phonograph going at a party. Maybe he'd be more happy if we give it over at his place." "You got something there," said Mac, "but I figure it ought to be like a surprise party. And how are we going to make like it's a party and not just us bringing over a jug of whiskey?" "How about decorations?" Huey suggested. "Like 4th of July or Halloween?" Mac's eyes looked off into space and his lips were parted. He could see it all. "Huey," he said, "I think you got something there. I never would have thought you could do it. But by God, you really rang a duck that time." His voice grew mellow and his eyes looked into the future. "I can just see it," he said. "Doc comes home. He's tired. He drives up. The place is all lit up. He thinks somebody's broke in. He goes up the stairs, and by God, the place has got the hell decorated out of it. There's crepe paper, there's favors, and big cakes. Jesus, he'd know it was a party then, and it wouldn't be no little mouse fart party either. And we're kind of hiding, so for a minute, he don't know who done it. And then we come out yelling. Can't you see his face? By God, Huey, I don't know how you thought of it." Huey blushed. His conception had been much more conservative, based in fact on the New Year's party at La Ida. But if it was going to be like that, why, Huey was willing to take credit. "I just thought it would be nice," he said. "Well, it's a pretty nice thing," said Mac. "And I don't mind saying when the surprise kind of wears off, I'm going to tell Doc who thought it up." They leaned back and considered the thing. And in their minds, the decorated laboratory looked like the conservatory at the Hotel Del Monte. They had a couple more drinks just to savor the plan. Lee Chong kept a very remarkable store. For instance, most stores buy yellow and black crepe paper and black paper cats, masks, and papier-mâché pumpkins in October, there is a brisk business for Halloween, and then these items disappear. Maybe they are sold or thrown out, but you can't buy them, say, in June. The same thing of 4th of July equipment. Flags and bunting and skyrockets. Where are they in January? Gone. No one knows where. This was not Lee Chong's way. You could buy valentines in November at Lee Chong's, shamrocks, hatchets, and paper cherry trees in August. He had firecrackers he had laid up in 1920. One of the mysteries was where he kept his stock, since this was not a very large store. He had bathing suits he had bought when long skirts and black stockings and head bandanas were in style. He had bicycle clips and tatting shuttles and mahjong sets. He had badges that said, "Remember the Maine," and felt pennants commemorating Fighting Bob. He had mementos of the Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915, little towers of jewels, and there was one other unorthodoxy in Lee's way of doing business. He never had a sale, never reduced a price, and never remaindered. An article that cost 30 cents in 1912 still was 30 cents, although mice and moths might seem to some to have reduced its value. But there was no question about it. If you wanted to decorate a laboratory in a general way, not being specific about the season, but giving the impression of a cross between Saturnalia and a pageant of the flags of all nations, Lee Chong's was the place to go for your stuff. Mac and the boys knew that. But Mac said, "Where are we going to get a big cake? Lee hasn't got nothing but them little bakery cakes." Huey had been so successful before, he tried again. "Why didn't Eddie bake a cake?" he suggested. "Eddie used to be a fry cook at the San Carlos for a while." The instant enthusiasm for the idea drove from Eddie's brain the admission that he had never baked a cake. Mac put it on a sentimental basis besides. "It would mean more to Doc," he said. "It wouldn't be like no goddamned old soggy bought cake. It would have some heart in it." As the afternoon and the whiskey went down, the enthusiasm rose. There were endless trips to Lee Chong's. The frogs were gone from one sack, and Lee's packing case was getting crowded. By 6 o'clock, they had finished the gallon of whiskey and were buying half pints of old tennis shoes at 15 frogs a crack, but the pile of decorating materials was heaped on the floor of the palace flophouse. Miles of crepe paper commemorating every holiday in vogue and some that have been abandoned. Eddie watched his stove like a mother hen. He was baking a cake in the wash basin. The recipe was guaranteed not to fail by the company which made the shortening. But from the first, the cake had acted strangely. When the batter was completed, it writhed and panted as though animals were squirming and crawling inside it. Once in the oven, it put up a bubble like a baseball, which grew tight and shiny, and then collapsed with a hissing sound. This left such a crater that Eddie made a new batch of batter and filled in the hole. And now the cake was behaving very curiously, for while the bottom was burning and sending out a black smoke, the top was rising and falling gluily, and a series of little explosions. When Eddie finally put it out to cool, it looked like one of Bel Geddes' miniatures of a battlefield on a lava bed. The cake was not fortunate, for while the boys were decorating the laboratory, Darling ate what she could of it, was sick in it, and finally curled up in its still warm dough and went to sleep. But Mac and the boys had taken the crepe paper, the masks, the broomsticks, the paper pumpkins, the red, white, and blue bunting, and moved over the lot across the street to the laboratory. They disposed of the last of the frogs for a quart of old tennis shoes and 2 gallons of 49-cent wine. "Doc is very fond of wine," said Mac. "I think he likes it even better than whiskey." Doc never locked the laboratory. He went on the theory that anyone who really wanted to break in could easily do it, and that people were essentially honest, and that finally, there wasn't much the average person would want to steal there anyway. The valuable things were books and records, surgical instruments, and optical glass, and such things that a practical working burglar wouldn't look at twice. His theory had been sound as far as burglars, snatch thieves, and kleptomaniacs were concerned, but it had been completely ineffective regarding his friends. Books were never borrowed. No can of beans ever survived his absence on several occasions. Returning late, he had found guests in his bed. The boys piled the decorations in the anteroom, and then Mac stopped him. "What's going to make Doc happiest?" he asked. "The party," said Hazel. "No," said Mac. "The decorations?" Huey suggested. He felt responsible for the decorations. "No," said Mac. "The frogs. That's going to make him feel best of all. And maybe by the time he gets there, Lee Chong might be closed and he can't even see the frogs until tomorrow." "No, sir," Mac cried. "Them frogs ought to be right here, right in the middle of the room, with a piece of bunting on it and a sign that says, 'Welcome home, Doc.'" The committee, which visited Lee, met with stern opposition. All sorts of possibilities suggested themselves to his suspicious brain. It was explained that he was going to be at the party so he could watch his property, that no one questioned that they were his. Mac wrote out a paper transferring the frogs to Lee in case there would be any question. When his protests weakened a little, they carried the packing case over to the laboratory, tacked red, white, and blue bunting over it, lettered the big sign with iodine on a card, and then they started the decorating from there. They had finished the whiskey by now, and they really felt in a party mood. They crisscrossed in crepe paper and put the pumpkins up. Passers-by in the street joined the party and rushed over to Lee's to get more to drink. Lee Chong joined the party for a while, but his stomach was notoriously weak and he got sick and had to go home. At 11 o'clock, they fried the steaks and ate them. Someone digging through the records found an album of Count Basie, and the great phonograph roared out. The noise could be heard from the boatworks of La Ida. A group of customers from the Bear Flag mistook Western Biological for a rival house and charged up the stairs whooping with joy. They were evicted by the outraged hosts, but only after a long, happy, and bloody battle that took out the front door and broke 2 windows. The crashing of jars was unpleasant. Hazel, going through the kitchens to the toilet, tipped the frying pan of hot grease on himself and the floor and was badly burned. At 1:30, a drunk wandered in and passed in remark which was considered insulting to Doc. Mac hit him with a clip which is still remembered and discussed. The man rose off his feet, described a small arc, and crashed through the packing case in among the frogs. Someone trying to change a record dropped the tone down and broke the crystal. No one has studied the psychology of a dying party. It may be raging, howling, boiling, and then a fever sets in and a little silence, and then quickly, it is gone. The guests go home or go to sleep or wander away to some other affair, and they have a dead body, and they leave a dead body. The lights blazed in the laboratory. The front door hung sideways by one hinge. The floor was littered with broken glass. Phonograph records, some broken, some only nicked, were strewn about. The plates with pieces of steak ends and coagulated grease were on the floor, on top of the bookcases, under the bed. Whiskey glasses lay sadly on their sides. Someone trying to climb the bookcase had pulled out a whole section of books and spilled them in broken-backed confusion on the floor, and it was empty. It was over. Through the broken end of the packing case, a frog hopped and sat feeling the air for danger, and then another joined him. They could smell the fine, damp, cool air coming in the door and through the broken windows. One of them sat in the fallen card, which said, "Welcome home, Doc," and then the two hopped timidly toward the door. For quite a while, a little river of frogs hopped down the steps, a swirling, moving river. For quite a while, Cannery Row crawled with frogs, was overrun with frogs. A taxi, which brought a very late customer to the Bear Flag, squashed 5 frogs in the street. But well before dawn, they all had gone. Some found the sewer, and some worked their way up the hill to the reservoir, and some went into culverts, and some only hid among the weeds in the vacant lot. And the lights blazed in the quiet, empty laboratory.